That's what it was about 10 minutes ago. Good morning, everybody. I would like to point out something that I just realized. That clock is not working. So I was hanging around here waiting for 10 o'clock. That would have been about 12 more minutes here. Well, good morning. Good to see all of you. I'm Jane Cole. I'm on the Sunday Forum Committee, and delighted you're here. I was reminded that we do have hearing devices here somewhere. I don't see them right now. They're around here somewhere. I hope nobody needs them. And we always do, for people who are remote, we do a session, and we are anxious that you would get your question on the mic, which I'll have and pass around if you ask a question. And I'll ask Katie if she would repeat the question, so we make sure the remote people are hearing it too. Well, I don't know if you realize, but the Sunday Forum this fall, we have done 3 sessions on housing. The first one was Jeff Hall on October 1st, and he was talking about a market rate building that his company collaborated with Dakota Friends on racial equity. It's out near Minnehaha, and a wonderful presentation. And that's still available on YouTube. On November 5th, we had Emily Bastian, who's a representative at Avivo, and she talked about tiny houses, and that is still available on YouTube. You can go back and pick that up. Today we have our Plymouth member, Katie Dillon, who is the Director of Align, which has taken me a long time to realize. I know it, but I kind of forget about it. Align was formerly the Downtown Congregations for Ending Homelessness, and Plymouth has been a member all along, and there are 17 congregations that are members, all downtown members of Align. So we are so proud of Katie, all the work that she does, and it's Katie Dillon, and I'll turn it over to her right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks so much for having me. It's always really fun to do presentations here at my home congregation and know so many of the friendly faces in the audience. So thank you and welcome everybody. So I'm going to go over just a little bit of information about our organization. A lot of you are really familiar with Align, but some may not be. So just want to tell you about our organization, kind of how we work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current context of homelessness, and then kind of get to the, okay, so now what? What do we do? As people of faith, as people here at Plymouth who have a big commitment to justice, what are we going to do? And then we'll have lots of time for Q&A, because I always find that is a very rich discussion. All right, so as Jane mentioned, Align began as downtown congregations to end homelessness. It was started in 2008. Plymouth was one of the founding members of the organization, and really it sprang out of a group of downtown clergy that get together on a regular basis, recognizing that the issue of homelessness is something that all of our congregations care about and that we really want to coordinate our efforts in addressing. And we sort of joke among our steering committee that it's one of the issues and topics, one of the few issues and topics that we really all agree on in our interfaith coalition, is that homelessness is unacceptable and that everyone really is deserving of a home. So we have an interfaith network. We have 17 member congregations. We're getting close to our 18th, so I'm excited to be able to update that slide when that happens. And we are also in coalition with people with lived experiences of homelessness. I'll talk a lot more about that, but really we see that as foundational to our organization. We take what we kind of call a multi-pronged approach to ending homelessness. So on one prong, trying to meet immediate needs of people who are housing insecure, housing unstable, experiencing homelessness, trying to meet those immediate needs while we do the long-term work and systemic work to address the reasons that homelessness exists and try to change those unjust systems that have been built, oftentimes intentionally in our own community, to exclude folks. And we are a very, very tiny organization ourselves. We're just 1.5 staff people, but really our power lies in our congregational network as well as in the coalitions that we work with. So we work with some local coalitions as well as some state coalitions. So I mentioned that foundational to our organization is really working with and among folks with lived experiences of homelessness. So, a lot of you have probably heard the phrase, nothing about us without us. That's something that really came out of the disability community, but we really see that as important in working on homelessness. The folks who are experiencing homelessness know what works to end homelessness. They know what issues they're facing in their community, and they are the ones that we want to have, kind of informing and driving the overall work of our organization. So one of the ways that we do this is we support a group called Street Voices of Change, which is an incredible organization. They are a group of about probably a total of 75 to 100 folks who have lived experiences of homelessness. Some folks may be currently homeless, some folks may have had a previous experience with homelessness. And they come together twice weekly, every week, hosted at a couple of our member congregations for meetings. In these meetings, they share resources, they support one another. There's a huge sense of community, celebrating joys, and working through grief together. And then also identifying what are the topics that they want to work for to change in their community. Okay, so what are the things that people are facing out there, and how can they make a difference and work for change? They have a ton of expertise, right? I mentioned, obviously they are the experts of their own experience, but also they're in these systems that a lot of us folks who are housed and who are, relatively privileged, and a lot of the folks in our member congregations, we're not working in those systems, right? We're not navigating. How do you access shelter? How do you get into housing? What's a housing referral? What's a housing assessment? We don't experience those things day in and day out. And so to be able to understand what folks are really going through as they're navigating all of those complicated systems is absolutely critical. And then as well, these folks are able to hold those systems accountable, right? We have an incredible relationship with some of the service providers from Hennepin County who come to those meetings regularly and are listening and hearing from folks. What's working, what's not? How are folks accessing shelter? Are they using a phone? Are they walking into the in-person location? Okay, if that in-person location goes away, then what will folks do? So really just trying to hold those systems accountable. And one of our big wins lately, we had a really huge win in the 2023 legislative session. Street Voices of Change worked really hard and in coalition with others to get an important change to the housing support program, which was formerly called GRH. Some of you might know about that program. It has historically been very unaffordable for people. So some folks in that program were paying 80–90% of their income to rent. And they worked really hard to make a change at the legislature so that folks who are on things like disability income or veterans benefits will only have to pay a third of their income to rent, which is then considered affordable. So really, really huge win, and will make a really big impact, not only for the people that are already in those programs, but also for people that are trying to exit homelessness and access programs that work for them. It'll make it affordable. This is just a really exciting moment that we had this fall. Street Voices of Change and Align were honored with an award at the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless Conference up in Duluth. So it is the Northern Light Award for Organizational Leadership, recognizing the work that Street Voices of Change has done over the last 7 years. So it was really exciting to honor that. Okay, so more about Align. So our organization, I mentioned kind of the multi-pronged approach, and the way that our organization is structured is similar to that multi-pronged approach. So in the long-term kind of systemic change prong, we have an organizing team that works within our member congregations. Plymouth is represented on that organizing team. And really the goal is within our member congregations, we want to educate folks so that they understand more about the issue of homelessness. We want to be able to inspire them, with stories. Sometimes we'll bring in Street Voices of Change folks so that they can hear directly from people who are impacted. And then we want to activate, get folks involved in advocacy, get folks involved at their local level, at their state level, to try to drive some of those bigger systemic changes. A couple of ways that the organizing team does this: we have a campaign guide that we publish 3 times a year, and each of those guides is focused on a specific topic related to homelessness. So in the fall, our guide was focused on what solutions we know work. Our winter guide, which will be coming out later this month, will be focused on youth homelessness and some of the organizations that are working with that population. And then we have our monthly newsletters as well. We have about 900 subscribers to that, and so that's another way that we're getting information out into the community. I'll put in a little plug that on my table here. You can sign up to get our monthly newsletter if you don't already, so just feel free to put your name on that list, or if you go onto our website, it'll prompt you to sign up for that as well. So that's kind of the long-term systemic side. And then on the meeting immediate needs side, we have what we call our direct service providers team. So some of our member congregations provide direct services themselves. So think of, for example, the Basilica of St. Mary. They have an outreach program where they do things like providing gas cards so that folks can get to new jobs, or providing ID vouchers. Our partner, Mount Olive Lutheran down in South Minneapolis, they have a diaper program, and they provide diapers. They also have a household goods program where they provide household goods for folks who have, very limited incomes, and that the money that they have is going to things like rent and food. And so, some of these other immediate needs that they have can be met within our community. That group also oversees a couple of the Align programs that we ourselves run. We have our emergency rental assistance program, which I'll talk a little bit more about coming up. And then we also have our street song choir, which is celebrating going into its 10th year, which is a group of folks who come together who either have experiences of homelessness or connections to homelessness, and we come together and create community through song, and it's just a really powerful and healing group. Yeah. So this is just a couple of really fun photo from our Homeless Day on the Hill just this past March. So this is, we got together folks from Street Voices of Change, folks from our member congregations, and we were there lobbying our legislators specifically around the housing support reform change that we wanted to see, and other important topics that we wanted to see laws changed and money put towards. And then this is just an example of this is the cover to our fall campaign. And like I said, it was focused on solutions to end homelessness. Okay, so I mentioned our emergency rental assistance program. This is our largest program that we ourselves at Align run, and it's a really great program that is an example of across the spectrum of addressing homelessness. There's everything from preventing homelessness from occurring in the first place, all the way to getting folks housed out of homelessness. And so on the front end, around homelessness prevention, this is actually one of the most critical ways in our community that we can address homelessness. I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but right now, unfortunately, we are at unprecedented levels of evictions in our community, and so we really see homelessness prevention as a key piece to make sure that folks can stay stable. How do we do this? So folks in our community, we all know that sometimes folks are really living on very thin margins in terms of limited income, high rents, right? So when folks come into a crisis situation, maybe it's they had to take care of a loved one who was sick and they had to take a couple of weeks off of work. That meant that they didn't have income for those 2 weeks, right? Because we don't always have comprehensive paid leave, and so they might have had to take time off without pay. Or maybe they had an emergency car repair that came up, and so instead of being able to pay rent, they had to pay this $800 car repair. Or sometimes folks have other expenses that come up that are unexpected. So when that happens, folks then end up getting behind in their rent, and it can be very, very difficult to get caught back up. Not only because folks have limited incomes, but then you're talking about adding on late fees every month, sometimes to the tune of $130. So you can imagine that it really starts to add up for folks, and it's really hard to come back from. So our program, we basically have multiple intake congregations, member congregations of ours that work with folks to get together an application, get together the documentation that we require, and apply to our program. And then if an application is approved by our program, we clear out their entire back due balance of rent and late fees so that they can be completely caught up and they can move forward and be stable going forward. So that's one of the unique things about our program is we don't do partial. We really want to get folks cleared and caught back up. As you can imagine, there's a huge need for this in our community. There are state programs, county programs that have this type of approach to homelessness prevention, but the need in the community far outpaces the resources that are available. Our program is also limited, but with our limited resources, we're really proud of the work that we've done. So far this year, we've already been able to assist over 100 households to get them caught back up, and that has translated to over $155,000. Average per household is about $1,500. So, you know, in some respects, that's a fairly modest amount. Sometimes it's even smaller, sometimes it's a little bit bigger, but you can see that a small amount can make a big, big difference. And just a little bit about the funding of this, because a lot of folks will ask about how this is funded. So our member congregations, they will provide financial financial contributions directly to this fund that will go out the door for direct assistance. And so most of the funding for this program comes from our member congregations. A lot of that money is like restricted funds that maybe somebody gave a legacy gift specifically to help people to help avoid homelessness. But then we also have individual donors. I mean, everything from, you know, $5, $10, $15 to, you know, larger amounts. So we do have some independent donor funding, but most of this funding comes from our member congregations. All right, so moving into the current context of homelessness, obviously the last few years have been very volatile, and there's just been a lot of things that have been happening in our community. So I'd love to just kind of ground us in what we've been hearing and what folks are experiencing in the community. So obviously, we all know that costs overall for everything in our lives has been rising. So that's, you know, gas, that's food, that's, you know, household goods, things like that. Rents have also been rising. Luckily, they've been rising a little more modestly than in other metro areas, but we still have seen people starting to get priced out of their places. We have a lot of what is called cost-burdened renters. So if somebody is paying more than 30% of their income to rent, they are considered cost-burdened. We have many, many, many households in Hennepin County that are cost-burdened. We also have a lot of households that are considered extremely cost-burdened, which means that they are paying over 50% of their income to rent. So you can imagine that has a huge impact. Again, kind of back to that homelessness prevention, folks just do not have the margins in their income to weather crises and emergencies. Another kind of terrible statistic that we've been seeing is that, unfortunately, as it relates to kind of those first two bullet items, seniors are our largest segment of population that are growing in homelessness. So you can imagine folks who are on fixed incomes, folks who have seen their rents rising, and eventually the math just does not work out anymore, and folks are put into homelessness. So I think we can all agree that homelessness for any population is unacceptable, but in particular seniors in our community. And what this has looked like is some of the folks that we know have had to return back to work as seniors, and that can be really limiting, you know, especially with health issues and mobility issues. So it's a real concern. And I mentioned earlier that evictions are at historic levels. The eviction moratorium that was in place during the COVID pandemic emergency, it ended in June of 2022, and since that time, evictions skyrocketed. But not only did they skyrocket, they have stayed at historic levels. And so we just have seen so many issues related to that. Not only do folks then become homeless, you know, sometimes newly homeless, but then it can also make it much more difficult in the long run to find a new place to stay if you have an eviction on your record. Shelters are sometimes full, mostly full, and sometimes over capacity. Individual adult shelters are running at about 97% full, or 97% to capacity. Family shelters are currently at overflow. They are at 359% capacity. In Hennepin County, there is a right to shelter for families with minor children, and so the reason that they're at 359% capacity is because they guarantee shelter what this looks like right now is they're putting a lot of families up in hotels, which, on one hand is great. Folks are, have a roof over their head, but that also means that they're not getting the services that folks who are in shelter get because the system is just incredibly overburdened. And then, of course, probably not a surprise to anybody, we know that we just don't have enough housing units. So across the board, we don't have enough housing units. And what that does is it puts pressure on all the different points in the system. That's one of the reasons that rents continue to rise. And we especially do not have enough affordable housing for people at low incomes, modest and low incomes. So 50% area median income, 30% area median income. We just do not have the units that are affordable to those folks. Okay, so what do we do? And this is always the question that comes up, right? Like, we can understand the issue and we can know that we don't want it to be this way, and so now what? So this whole first slide is something that Street Voices of Change has been talking about and really advising us in our member congregations on is how can we be an ally to folks experiencing homelessness? So again, going back to our foundational principle that we want to be listening to folks with lived experience, what are they telling us? So what does it look like to be an ally? One is we want to uplift and we want to amplify those voices. It is so common, and of course, I think we all do this, that we can kind of get mired in the data, right? Like, we want the statistics and we want the numbers. And yes, that's important because that is one of the ways that we can understand the topic. But fundamentally, we want to be listening to the human aspect of how this is affecting and impacting people in our community. We also obviously want to be learning from folks. What's working for them? What's not? What barriers are they facing? We had a really incredible town hall just this last Thursday night, and one of our Street Voices members, his name is Cecil, he spoke at that about some of the barriers that he has faced. And you could tell that everyone in the room was just like, oh my gosh, why is this so hard? Why is it so complicated? Why are there all these barriers? And again, for those of us who aren't navigating these systems, it's so important that we hear those stories. We also want folks to educate themselves, educate your neighbors, educate your friends, and let go of a lot of the misconceptions that folks have around homelessness. Understandably, folks don't always know, why do folks become homeless? Why are folks unable to come out of homelessness? And so really trying to understand what the reality is and challenge some of those myths. Like, some folks might be like, well, why don't folks just get a job? And it's like, okay, most of the people that are experiencing homelessness actually do work. Many have income, and that's not always necessarily the solution. All right, so what else do we do? So the other thing that we know is we need huge investments across the continuum. When we say the continuum, this is everything from homelessness prevention to money in our shelter systems to make sure that people have a safety net, all the way into building more housing and more affordable housing. There was a huge and historic investment at the state legislature last year. It was an incredible win. There was $1 billion committed to housing across the spectrum. And yet we know that historically there has been significant underinvestment in housing. And so even that $1 billion, we're not getting there. We're not making up for that underinvestment. And unfortunately, sometimes that investment or lack of investment can be at sort of at the mercy of who is in control of the legislature. And I think that I would hope that we can all agree that no matter your political leanings, homelessness should be an issue that we should all find unacceptable across our state. So some of the things that we specifically are pushing for and that we will push for and we will have more advocacy initiatives around through Align. One is continuing investment in preventing homelessness from occurring. There are state programs that are not meeting the need. I talked about there's a huge need. We're a tiny program. We really want the state to continue to invest in those programs and make them easier to access when folks need them. They should not get so far as to be in housing court to be able to access resources. They need to get that earlier in the process. We also are an endorser of the Constitutional Amendment for Housing campaign. This is a somewhat new campaign. I don't know, some of you may have started to hear about it. It is calling for a historic long-term investment Sort of similar to how the legacy amendment for the arts was framed. It's a constitutional amendment that would put a 0.3% sales tax in place that would then fund over $400 million in revenue every year that would go into preventing homelessness and supporting renters. There would be a designated fund related to home ownership and closing the home equity and wealth gap, and then investment in housing. And so that's a big initiative, and you'll probably hear more about it. I hope that we can do some advocacy work around that, but it's really exciting. And this is meant to answer that challenge of the historic underinvestment in housing. And then, of course, building more and maintaining current housing. So this might look like housing infrastructure bonds. It might look like tax incentives for developers. It might look like cash flowing into our public housing to make sure that it's maintained in a way that is safe. And so that's, just really focusing on the actual housing stock. And then the other piece of kind of the work that we do at Align that we want to make sure that we're engaging folks on is really kind of that relationship building and connecting with folks who are unhoused, folks who are housing insecure, to really understand, hear from them, and develop those relationships and really start to see that kind of human aspect of this. And then, of course, I say it all the time, people probably get sick of hearing me say this, but working together. This is the kind of thing that none of us can do as a singular person, none of us can do as just our own congregation, that it really will take all of us. It will take all of us working together across our coalition and across the state to do what we need to do to resolve this. All right, so I would love to move into question and answer, and yeah, looks like we've already got a couple questions, and let's make sure we get the mic. Oh, okay, Jane's got the mic.
Who has the question? Sorry, go first.
Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it. Can you tell me what Housing Court is and how it works?
Yeah, great question. So Housing Court is a special sort of like branch of the court system that is specifically related to resolving housing issues and renters issues. Most of the folks that end up in Housing Court are facing what's called a court-ordered eviction. And the way that process works is a landlord files a court filing, whatever it's called, a court case. Then there is a court date set. And the renter, the tenant is asked to come to court. The landlord is there in court, and the landlord will say, here's why I am bringing this eviction action. Most often, that eviction action is related to back due rent. So people have a balance that they haven't paid, and the landlord is trying to get a court order to have that paid. Two things might happen. One, if a tenant does not show up to court, usually the judge will find in favor of the landlord. So we always, and I will just say this blanket statement, that if you ever know anybody who gets called into eviction court that is a tenant, we encourage them to show up. If they do not show up, they will not, they essentially will, the eviction will move forward. Sometimes folks can get some financial assistance at court. There's also a new law in Minneapolis that they will have representation, so they can come to court and they can get an attorney assigned to represent them. And then once they're actually in that court date, a judge might say, okay, you have X amount of days to pay the back due rent, otherwise then the eviction will move forward. Oftentimes those payment plans are very, very aggressive, and it's virtually impossible for most folks to be able to meet those payment plans without external assistance. But if somebody is able to make those payment plans and make that payment, then they can remain in their home. However, the eviction is usually still on their record. So unless they then go to get it expunged, they will still have what's called an unlawful detainer on their record, even if they can remain in their home. Worst case scenario, they don't meet that payment plan, and then what's called an unlawful detainer is filed with the sheriff. The sheriff will show up at the person's door and give them this piece of paper, and that tenant then has to vacate at that exact moment when the sheriff is there. Yep, and the sheriff can, unfortunately, basically has the purview to forcibly remove people, and then the lock is changed and that's it. And then you can imagine, right, folks will lose their belongings. Any number of things happen. And so then at that point as well, that eviction is on their record in addition. Yes.
Katie, would you talk about special challenges faced by people who have a history of incarceration or a criminal record?
Yes, thank you for that question, Karen. So this is absolutely one of the barriers that we see from folks trying to access housing. So at a lot of different levels, there are ways that landlords and housing opportunities can exclude folks who have criminal history on their background. From the time that folks are doing an application, sometimes there's criminal history look back. Also, different housing vouchers exclude folks. So things like the federal voucher Section 8 excludes certain types of criminal history. So folks can't access that type of voucher to make their housing affordable. And then certain housing opportunities, certain landlords, certain property management companies may not rent to folks who have certain types of criminal history on their background. One of the stories that was told on Thursday night was that, even things that was, even history that was like 20 years ago was showing up on people's records and making it really difficult to access housing. We've had some folks who have had a decade or more of experiencing homelessness that have recently gotten into housing, and it was because they had a case manager that was able to work with them to navigate all of those barriers. Because not only are there barriers, but you can imagine that if you've been excluded from so many housing opportunities, that is like mentally and emotionally incredibly draining, right? You just see doors closing, doors closing, doors closing, and you really start to lose hope. And so having some help to work through those barriers is huge. Yeah, thanks. Oh, Doug.
Hi, Katie.
Hi.
I really support public funding. It broadens, the 0.4% of sales tax or whatever you were talking about, really helps broaden the source of the funding. But my fear is that when a governmental agency is involved in the funding, the process falls into the whole bureaucracy and the barriers. Is there a foreseeable way to balance that?
Yeah.
And I understand there needs to be safeguards to the public funds as well, so that they're used properly. But.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So thank you for bringing that up. One of the concerns that has been brought up in Street Voices of Change, actually, when we've talked about this constitutional amendment for housing is, how do we know that this money isn't just going to go into a system that already isn't working for people? And one of the unique things that I've really appreciated about the constitutional amendment for housing specifically, that campaign in the way that they're building this legislation is that there were the 3 buckets of funding that I mentioned, and each of those buckets of funding would be governed by basically a citizens group. And so each bucket of funding would have, I think the number is 21 people from the community that would oversee how that funding was being used, including folks who have been impacted by that specific issue. So if it's related to renters, okay, there's going to be renters on that advisory committee. It's not necessarily a solve-all, but I do think that recognizing that there needs to be community oversight into how these funds are being used, and that if it's not working, how can we, hold accountable that source of funding, and how can we make sure that it's going into things that are working for folks? So, there's a lot to work out in some of those details, but I think it's a really important point. Absolutely. Thank you.
Katie, I don't know that I understood what you said about all the money that the legislature approved and that it's not going anywhere. And is there a campaign for calling our legislators? That would be helpful.
Yeah, so at the last legislative session, there was $1 billion committed for housing. Now, I don't have all the exact details about how that is going into the housing system. It is getting out there. It's slow. I mean, it doesn't happen immediately, but it is getting out there. But it ranges from everything from in capital investment for like shelter improvements to make sure that they're safe and dignified. Also, things like services for youth experiencing homelessness. And so there's just a range of things that this investment is going towards. I think that there are ways that it could be more transparent, and I don't know necessarily if I have a great kind of answer to how to get there. But that money is flowing, and it is getting out there, and we hope that, within the next year or two, we'll see that impact. I think it can be hard, though, to wait, right? Like, how do you, there's all this money, there's this real immediate need right now. One example is there was an additional $50 million committed to the state homelessness prevention program. It's called FHPAP. It was called a fast track allocation, and the money was required to be spent by September of this past fall. And that money, they got it out there and they spent it, and it helped people stay in their homes. So it was a very real way that money actually made an immediate impact. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I'm really compelled by the Street Voices for Change and the ways that that the grounding of your organization's work in the lived experiences of people with currently or very recent experiences with homelessness, how that shapes your work. In my own career in education, I've often found that efforts from usually largely white, middle-class, educated organizations to try to welcome the voices of Black and brown people, usually who are most harmed by current systems, who they genuinely are trying to help, that there's a lack of trust, and that it becomes extractive, and that it's not actually following the lead of. And I just would love to hear about how in your work you all have built that trust, and how you continue to earn that trust, and what kinds of things have made a difference.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's absolutely something to really recognize and be very aware of, and that we always have to be constantly reminding ourselves of. One of the ways that we have incorporated lived experience voices into our organization is that we do have 2 seats on our steering committee, which is sort of like our board of directors, that are designated for Street Voices of Change folks. And so we really, we want to make sure that at every decision-making table that folks are included in that conversation. And I think structurally, that great, we have them on our steering committee. That's great. And I think your point about how do you develop trust and relationship over time, I think that it's mutual, and we really have tried and been very intentional about making sure that we are accountable to those folks, that we're not making decisions without their input. One of the big tenets of Street Voices of Change is that no decisions are made by 1 or 2 people, that really it's all about group decision making, which can be hard, right? It can be messy, it can be complicated, it can take a really long time. And so just reminding ourselves that no matter how messy and how long it takes, that is what is most important, and that's where the value is. And I think, we also as individuals and as organizational partners, as congregations, are trying to do some of that work as well, to kind of break down some of those, kind of white supremacist systems and the ways that we have historically done things. But it's something to continually be aware of, and never take for granted, and always be committed to.
To me, the homelessness, affordable housing, and school capacity can all relate to each other. Just recently it said Minneapolis schools have capacity for 40,000 students, and there are only 22,000. Driving into church today, went by some recycled motels that are becoming housing for people. So to me, we have to take a broader picture than just homelessness. It's all 3 things should be looked at.
Right. Well, and I think, I think the question is sort of like, in terms of kind of our overarching community, we're seeing a lot of interrelated issues, right? It's about, the way that I kind of want to reflect it back is, we know that not all the needs of all of the people in our community are being met, whether it's, different school opportunities, different housing opportunities. They're very interrelated. And I think for me, a lot of times I go back to how are we investing in these things, at the state level, at the local level. How are we making sure that we're sort of looking at that big picture and making sure that all of the needs are met. And I do want to just call out one thing that you mentioned about the motels that are being converted into housing. One of the things that I didn't really touch on, but is kind of an important piece about the housing units, is this sort of creative problem solving that's kind of going on out there, and that you're seeing all sorts of different types of housing being developed. There's an organization called Envision Communities, which Street Voices of Change has been very involved with, that's working on building a tiny home community in North Minneapolis. There's conversion of former motels into what's called single room occupancy housing, so more like a small efficiency unit, sometimes with shared kitchens, that can be more market rate, but at an affordable rate. So, $400 of rent versus, $900, $1,000 of rent, so that people who just, have lower incomes are able to afford the rent. So really, it's kind of cool to see a lot of the different creative opportunities that people are doing out there, and even faith communities as well. First Covenant downtown created housing on their land downtown. We live right by Calvary Lutheran Church in South Minneapolis that just put up an affordable housing unit through a developer called Trellis. St. Olaf downtown is going to be developing affordable housing on their site. And so really just saying, like, what assets do we have and how can we invest in being part of the creative solutions?
Katie, I was just wondering, is there a informal or formal relationship between Beacon and Align?
Yeah, informally, I would say. And I wrote down on my sheet to make sure that I mention our Housing Justice Committee here at Plymouth, which we just started a couple of months back. And actually, Kate Tabor, who is the Minneapolis organizer for Beacon, and myself are part of that group. And at other congregations that we share, we've talked about how do we not necessarily duplicate efforts, but come together when we have some shared, values and shared initiatives. So, for example, the housing town hall that we had on Thursday evening, we were both part of that planning and that turnout. We know that there will be some advocacy opportunities coming up at different member congregations where we might combine forces and, do some different advocacy campaigns. So I think historically our organizations have not always kind of been on the same page, just for whatever reason. We've just sort of done our own things. But we really want to be more intentional about, because we just do have so many shared values, and we have a lot of shared congregations, which is great. Thanks.
I was curious, that $1,500 sort of average rental assistance amount, do you have an estimate of sort of like if somebody doesn't get that assistance or, isn't able to stay in their home, what is the sort of cost or the average cost once they get evicted, once they lose housing?
Right.
Because I know I've seen that kind of comparison for other similar things, but.
Yeah, I don't have an exact figure, but services and resources to support folks who are experiencing homelessness are incredibly expensive. Shelter costs, case management costs to get them into a new place, just vastly, vastly outweighs that more modest investment up front. And so we sort of know that the math is that we should keep people in our homes. And I think, the more that as a state or as the federal government, if they could get anything done, if we could invest in that end of the spectrum, truly it would save money. And I think, we talk about also the kind of broader costs of experiencing homelessness. So, you think about kids who might have to get the special bus to go to their same school, but like that, it adds like all sorts of complication. They might have, challenges when it comes to school. People might have challenges when it comes to holding onto their job. Maybe they had been living in a place that was right off the bus line and they could get to work easy, and now they're, it's not as easy for them. So there's these sort of like additional costs that kind of, come out from that. So yeah, we definitely know that the investment on the upfront side is so much, the cost is so much less than that broader experiences of homelessness. I should get the numbers though. That would be just, it's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah.
Katie, hi. I'm energized by that idea of the sales tax, but I'm reminded, or am not reminded, the legacy amendment. I was consulted on that along the way. I said, no way will it pass. It was a time of a recession, and I gave it a zero chance. Instead, 67% of Minnesotans voted for it. But it was tricky politics.
Yeah.
And what they did, and it's worth thinking about for you, they built a coalition not just for arts people, but all the environmental groups around the state. And as you think about, have you thought about, or at the beginning stages of thinking about the politics of this? Because it would be marvelous if it passed, but it won't be.
Yeah.
You need to think really broadly to get the state behind that.
Yeah, so there is a coalition being built and that we are part of. The campaign overall is called Our Future Starts at Home. And so they have across the state coalition partners. They're having conversations about how housing and housing pressures look across the state because, you know, our experiences in the metro area may be different, although we know that homelessness exists and people are facing housing pressures all across the state. And so that group, that coalition is really trying to do a lot of that kind of foundation laying work to really understand how to drive through kind of, you know, the political aspect of it. So more to come, and we'll see, you know, what this legislative session holds, because the first step is getting it through the legislature in order to then get it on the ballot. But yes, absolutely, that's a really important point. And I think, you know, it's one of those conversations where we need to be relationship building. It can't just be, you know, we can't just expect it to happen without that.
One last question, I think.
Katie, do you have a timeline for the constitutional amendment?
Yeah, so so the legislation is prepared to move forward in this legislative session. If it passes this legislative session, so spring of 2024, it would be on the ballot in fall of 2024. It's really hard to know if it will go through the legislative session, if it will pass this legislative session. I think, you know, it could kind of go either way at this point. But if it does, then, you know, the big push would be the 2024 fall election. But if not, then it would basically get pushed out a year for passing the legislature, and then I think it wouldn't be on the ballot until 2026. Don't quote me on that, but there has to be like it has to be on a certain cadence with the ballot. But yeah, so we'll see. So I mean, more to come, right? Like I'll come back and talk about it, and you know, we'll have our Housing Justice Committee working on it. So we'll keep all of you informed.
Jane, just one on that point for everybody. That's something you can mention to your legislator, because lobbying groups are after them all the time, but when they start hearing the community talking about something sort of on their own, that raises, the antennas go up, and all of a sudden it makes more sense. So
So just to repeat it, so Jim's point is talk about it with your legislator, and that, you know, they're really listening to what are folks thinking about, what are folks caring about. And I always like to tell people, you don't have to be an expert on it, like that's not your role as an individual, but you can say, I care about this issue, here's why, and I want you to be paying attention to it. You know, that's what you say to your legislator, and then they're gonna, you know, they're gonna be more mindful of it. So thank you all, appreciate it.
How fortunate are we to have Katie in our congregation? Oh, my word. Thank you, Katie. Next week, December 10th, we are going to hear about the beneficiaries for the Christmas Eve offering. And we are going to have 3 people telling us about it. Kate Tabor, Karen Barstad is here, and E.J. Kelly. And they're going to, I think it's going to be an emphasis on housing justice, somewhat, E.J. was telling me. And so next week, 10 o'clock, we'll see you here. Thanks so much.